Okay, today we are closing in now on the 20th century after our long background sections, and we will get to one of the main characters of our story, Adolf Hitler. So we are getting down into the nitty-gritty of things at the moment. Hitler was born in Austria, not Germany. He was the son of a small or minor customs or minor civil servant in Austria. His father died when he was 15. He went off to Vienna, basically left school, a school dropout at a very early age, and in Vienna led a life of drift, of lack of any success, did not get into art school or architecture school, which had been his aspiration. And basically lived a very unstructured, marginal life in Vienna until 1913, when he left for Germany, probably because he wanted to avoid conscription into the Austro-Hungarian army. But in Germany in 1914, when World War I broke out, we have a picture of the great crowd that gathered in the main square of Munich, where in Munich, like in so many cities in Europe, the populations were enthusiastically cheering the outbreak of war. This was going to be a great adventure in which everybody would go off, become a hero, and be home by Christmas and have a good time. Of course, it didn't work out that way. But someone with very keen eyes, or at least a magnifying glass, has spotted Hitler in the crowd. And he is sitting there with the expression really of glazed ecstasy on his face. There's almost no other term for it. Clearly for him, the outbreak of World War I was an important and welcomed event. He immediately volunteered for the German army. And against all odds, bad luck, he actually survived 4 years on the Western Front. Given how many other people died within minutes of arriving, this must be one of the colossal bad odds of history that he never caught a shrapnel shell or anything like that that finished him off. But he not only survived the war, he enjoyed the war. The war for him gave him structure, gave him purpose, gave him camaraderie, a sense of being part of a larger, plan or larger program in life. And he was full-heartedly in favor of the war, not one of those who became increasingly disaffected with the futility of it all. Though he was there for 4 years, he never went beyond the rank of corporal, as one of his officers ironically wrote, not leadership material. One of the, again, more ironic aspects of the story. In any case, he was in a hospital suffering from the after effects of a gas attack when the war ended, and ended for him in an utterly unexpected way, as it did for many Germans. Germany spent most of the war fighting on other people's territory. The German armies were in northern France. The German armies, of course, had been deep in Eastern Europe. And in 1917, when the Russian Revolution broke out and the communists took over, Russia drops out of the war. Germany wins the war in the east and annexes huge areas that will be part of a vast East German empire. And then they have one last chance to win in the west before the impact of the American entry into the war begins to tip the scales. They came close to winning in the west in the spring of 1918. They did not, and then having, in a sense, shot their bolt, having exhausted their last reserves, the turn of the tide came very quickly. From the summer, July, August, September, within a few months, the Allies began to advance. The German position began to crumble, and the German generals then very rapidly demanded the government get an armistice before the German army would collapse entirely. Germany, who had been told all this time they were winning, and certainly for Hitler, who had been in this on French territory, German defeat seemed inexplicable. We know from looking at it that Germany simply exhausted itself, was fighting beyond its means. Finally, the gas tank was on empty, and the whole war machine ground to a halt, and Germany was losing, and losing very rapidly in the summer, fall of 1918, when they called it quits. But for most Germans, that simply was not understood. And the fact that the defeat was then combined with several other things in rapid succession. The very point at which Germany asks and signs an armistice, the Kaiser is overthrown. Within months, there is a new democratic constitution, and with months after that, the Allies impose the Versailles Treaty. And so from basically November of 1918 to June 1919, Germany has defeat, revolution, a new democratic constitution, and the imposition of what most Germans considered a catastrophically unfair and draconic peace, though nothing as draconic as what they imposed in the East when they won. Germans thought they could fight the war on a basis of, heads we win and tails it's a draw. We should never pay for this if we lose. But lose they did, but they then didn't understand why and how they had lost. And thus, very quickly, there grew up a right-wing explanation for the defeat, and that explanation was the stab in the back. Germany had not lost the war on the field. Germany was winning the war when it was betrayed on the home front. And it was betrayed on the home front by the anti-war factions, the Social Democrats, and by the racial traitors, the Jews. So Jews and socialists, Jews and Marxists became the explanation for this mysterious and sudden, inexplicable defeat. And this became the common accepted wisdom of the right wing in Germany. Virtually all of Germany agreed upon the iniquity of the Versailles Treaty, and half of Germany at least agreed upon the stab in the back, and that Germany had not lost on the battlefield, but lost because of disloyal elements at home that had brought about this disaster upon them. That, in a sense, is the crystallizing moment, we might say, for Hitler in terms of giving him a new direction in life. Unlike most German soldiers who wanted to get out of the army as fast as they could, wanted to mobilize as fast as they could, Hitler stayed in the army. And he stayed in as a kind of education propaganda officer in the city of Munich, where he would report to his commander on the political scene around him, check out various political groups. Munich was in chaos at that point. There had been a succession of first left-wing and then right-wing governments with much violence, the street fighting, coups, and that sort of thing. And Hitler, in a sense, was to be the political watchdog on behalf of his commander. Attending one of these political meetings of one of these small groups in Munich, the German Workers' Party, he became attracted to it, decided to join it, quickly showed something in terms of skill that he had not had an opportunity to show before, that he was a very skilled orator that could speak and communicate with people not in a normal conversation, but shouting across a beer hall in a one-way conversation. And his speaking skills very quickly led him to the leadership position of this German Workers' Party, which was then renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, what we refer to as the Nazis for short. And so Hitler, against all previous indications in his earlier career of drift and atomization on the one hand and a low-ranking soldier on the other, becomes a politician. And one of the key things we want to look at before we follow that political career and how the Nazis get to power, in a sense, is how do we assess what drives Hitler. The initial take on Hitler, in a sense, his first great biography by Alan Bullock was called Hitler, A Study in Tyranny. And the assumption was that Hitler kind of fit the pattern of traditional tyrants, a power-hungry opportunist who sought power for the sake of power, exercised that power very skillfully in the early phases, became increasingly filled with his own sense of infallibility, until, like the whole notion of Greek tragedy, overstepped himself and lost his sense of restraint and bit off more than he could chew, with the invasion of Russia, just as Napoleon had done in 1812, and brought about his own downfall because he had lost all sense of measure and restraint. A kind of classic hubris of tyranny on the classic Greek model, which almost every British schoolboy read through all their years, and in their political study of Hitler, in a sense, applied what was to them the obvious model. That model almost invariably left out Hitler's anti-Semitism and his obsessive racism and the Holocaust. Books written about Nazi Germany between 1945 and the 70s will surprisingly have very little about the Holocaust and Hitler's anti-Semitism. It remained kind of a side issue, a curiosity, something exotic about the man, but not seen to be either fundamental to him or to National Socialism. That changed beginning, I guess I would say, in the 60s, and really becomes increasingly such that by the 1980s, understanding the Holocaust and Hitler's anti-Semitism is absolutely intertwined with and central to the study of National Socialism, modern Germany, and the study of World War II can't take place without recognition of the centrality of the Holocaust. But that was not true with the first generation after the war, for whom old models were seen as a way to understand Hitler, not understanding who in a sense had to deal with a very different person. So what really began, and the man really key here, and I think wrote one of the best early books on it, was a man named Eberhard Jäckel, in which Eberhard Jäckel wrote a book, in German it was called Hitler's Weltanschauung, Hitler's Worldview. I think it had a bad English translation of Hitler's Blueprint for Power or something like that. But in any sense, he took Hitler's idea seriously. Hitler was not just a power seeker for the sake of power. He had an ideology. He had a thought-out political philosophy, and you couldn't understand what made the man tick unless you understand how those thoughts came together in the 20s, how after he entered politics, he, over the period from roughly 1919 to 1927, put together in his own mind an understanding of what made the world work, and then this ideology kind of crystallized, became quite ossified after that, but it is key to understanding how he viewed the world, what were the glasses through which Hitler looked at the world, and would shape the way in which he saw the world, and what were his notions that would shape his priorities, that would give him a sense of where he thought things were going, what direction did he want to make things go, and so a study of Hitler's ideology then begins, I think, with Eberhard Jäckel and has proceeded since. But basically, I will be following, in a sense, in this first part of this lecture, in his footsteps and putting together the stages by which Hitler's worldview comes together and gains a kind of coherence by the late 1920s. As I had said earlier, Hitler begins his political career with the astonishment and trauma of German defeat and the Versailles Treaty. And initially, like most other Germans, both accepted the stab in the back and the need to get rid of the Versailles Treaty. So for Hitler, like many Germans, and particularly almost everyone on the German right, they are following a policy that was called revisionism. How do you revise the World War I settlement? How do you undo the defeat and repair, in a sense, the damage that had taken place? So for Hitler, fighting another war is accepted as necessary. You're going to have to refight World War I, only this time you're going to have to win it. And then the question is, in a sense, how are you going to do that? How is the verdict of a second war going to be different from the first if you lost the first? And so Hitler initially is thinking in terms of how do we reconfigure, in terms of his foreign policy, how do we reconfigure the sides on which different countries fought? And looking around, he basically says the Kaiser blew it by attacking Russia, France, and England together. encircling Germany and fighting all of these people at once. And that if you basically pick up the powers that were disaffected from the outcome of World War I and don't attack the English, who he doesn't think Germany has necessarily irreconcilable goals with, at least initially, you can fight the Second War with different partners than had taken place in the First War. First of all, the Soviet Union is now neutralized. They're engaged in a big civil war between the Reds and the Whites, the Bolsheviks and the reactionaries, and no one is going to ally with them. So Russia is out of the picture. Italy came away from World War I utterly disappointed. Italy is a country who didn't enter World War I until 1915. And did so in the most crudest way of putting himself up for bid. Who offers us more territory if we win on your side? And the Allies offered them more territory at the expense of Austria-Hungary than the Axis, the Central Powers, could offer at the expense of France. And Italy comes in on the side of the Allies. Those who thought this would tip the scales were terribly disappointed. Very quickly, Italy becomes a country the Allies have to bolster and send forces to keep it in the war. It becomes a liability rather than an asset. As Winston Churchill so often comes up with the most apt remark, in 1935 and after Italy is moving towards Hitler's Germany, and someone said when Churchill is opposing appeasement and saying we must stand up to Hitler, and one of his conservative friends says, "Oh, but if that led to war, next time Italy would be on the other side." To which Churchill said, "That's only fair, we had them last time." So in any case, Italy went into the war for the wrongest reasons, and then Woodrow Wilson basically helps dictate the peace settlement, has introduced the doctrine of self-determination, and rejects Italy being rewarded all the Slavic territories of what is now the coast of Croatia and Slovenia, and says they must go to Yugoslavia, not to Italy. And so Italy leaves the peace table, storms out in a great huff, talking about the stolen victory, that they had been deprived of all the fruits of victory they had been promised. So for Hitler, Italy is there for the picking up. And of course, we know very quickly, not only are they going to be there as a disappointed from the Versailles Treaty, but very quickly they will become a fascist partner. Mussolini comes to power 10 years before Hitler is in fact the pioneer of fascism in Europe. So Hitler does understand from a very early point Italy is a prime possibility as an ally. But more importantly, he thinks that simply by assuring Britain that it can keep its empire, that Germany has no claim overseas, they simply want to rectify the changes on the continent in terms of World War I. England will not fight the next time. They're not going to be hauling France's chestnuts out of the fire if their own empire is not threatened. So he thinks he basically can refight the war with a different alliance system. In terms of the Jews, in fact, the very first political document we have from Hitler is the so-called Gentlet Letter. Mr. Gemmlich wrote to Hitler's commander in September 1919 and asked him, in terms of all the chaos and political upheaval going on in Munich, what did he make of the Jewish question? How should that be factored in? And Hitler's commander gives the letter to Hitler to answer, and Hitler does answer it. And as I say, this is the first political document that we have that Hitler actually crafted, in which Hitler basically says two key things. First of all, the Jewish question, the Jewish problem. This is the language, of course, we've seen that was there from Wilhelm Marr in the late 19th century. The Jews are a question or a problem, begging a solution or an answer. The Jewish question is a racial question. The Jews are not a religion, they are a race, and they are a race different from Germans. They are aliens within Germany. They have no home here. They don't belong here. And secondly, he says that problem will be solved not by pogroms, not by anti-Jewish riots, not by emotional anti-Semitism. Hating Jews and saying bad things about Jews and rioting against Jews is not going to be the answer. The answer is going to be solved by logical anti-Semitism, which is going to require various legislative measures which progressively deprive Jews of their rights in Germany, dismantling emancipation, turning them once again into a group within Germany without rights, and then to get them out of Germany altogether. The removal of the Jews altogether is Hitler's solution at this point. Now, looking back through the lens of Auschwitz, many historians' initial reaction to that letter was to see the phrase, the removal of the Jews altogether, as a kind of code word for Auschwitz from the very beginning. And I think that is a real ahistorical hindsight reading. That in fact in 1919 that was meant quite literally. It meant ethnic cleansing and expelling. First you take the Jews' rights away and then you kick them out of the country. And that the Jewish question in Germany would be solved basically by chasing all the Jews out. And that would be done by a step-by-step policy of de-emancipation, of new discrimination, and finally of expulsion. So that's how Hitler sort of sees things at the beginning of his career in the early 1920s. As his movement grows and he begins to collect around himself some of the right-wing quacks that were running around Munich at this time, he then begins to adopt and to take in some of their ideas and begins to draw a wider picture. One thing that is key is his conversion to, or his realization that he must see the Jewish question as a racial question within a wider social Darwinist framework. That in fact there is history then he begins to see as a racial struggle. This goes back, of course, to Gobineau and social Darwinism in the mid-19th century. If Marx says all history is determined by class struggle, Hitler says no, all history is determined by race struggle. And that this race struggle is connected to a kind of geopolitical vision. What is key in this struggle between races is territory, is land. And those people that do two things: seize the land that produces the food that allows your population to grow will become more powerful. Those that do not fight well and lose land will have less land, less food, will have a smaller population, which puts them on the downward escalator in which they will lose the next war and the next war until they go into oblivion. This is the struggle of the survival of the fittest, the continual eternal fight of different races for land in order to feed a growing population, to make them bigger and more powerful with larger armies than their other racial competitors. And the Nazi term for this was Lebensraum, living space. And that people needed space to live, space to expand. And that this need to conquest. In a sense, this says the natural state of man is eternal war. Wimps may think peace is what you're after. Real men know that war is what you're all about. And the whole purpose of races, of history, is to fight a never-ending series of wars, to win more Lebensraum, to become more powerful, to win the next war. Hitler's vision is that eternal war and the need to continually expand your Lebensraum is simply the state of nature in which man lives. This is the human condition. The second condition in this state of nature as eternal war is not only do you need more land to feed more people, for those people to fight well and to be strong have to remain racially pure. Now again, this whole notion of race is kind of as a construct, as an invention. But part of that invention is the unquestioned assumption: pure race is strong, mixed race is weak. The way in which races degenerate is either don't conquer enough land to feed themselves, and their birth rates decline and their numbers go down, or they mix their blood with other people's, and by virtue of diluting the purity of their race, they become inherently weaker. So for Hitler, in a sense, what you have is race and space. keep your race pure, conquer space, and you will win in this human condition of eternal struggle and eternal war. So this is not a very pleasant outlook, but this is basically what Hitler sees as the human condition. So Germany will always, and Germany being in the middle position in Europe, will always be struggling against the French on the west, the Slavs to the east, and that they have to be eternally vigilant. And the great problem of the Versailles Treaty, of course, is it took away territory, made Germany smaller, but it also demilitarized Germany so it couldn't fight. That basically it left Germany poised to disappear. It was a dagger at the heart of Germany that was an existential threat for German survival that then had to be undone if Germany was going to gain more territory and to expand and win against all of its racial competitors that surrounded it. In this, then, the struggle against other races is simply natural. This is what everybody has to do. But within this view, there is a special position for the Jews. If all races are in this eternal conflict, and all of them are going to win or lose, depending upon how much territory they gain and how pure they keep their race, the Jews are something else. They're a different game altogether. Jews do not have a territory. Jews are a rootless nomadic people. They don't have their own state. They live only as parasites among other peoples. They're always living in other people's host nation, where they pose two threats to all the host nations among whom they live. Jews are a threat not only to Germans. Jews are a threat to everybody. Jews are a threat to the very way in which nature itself works, the eternal struggle, because as a rootless people without a state, without land themselves, living only as parasites among others, they pose two threats. One threat is that they will intermarry and create impure races, contaminate the blood of their host nations, whether it be Germany or France or England or anyone else, making them weaker. And the second is the Jews are the carriers of subversive ideas that cripple the capacity of peoples to fight the war of nature that nature decrees. And this is where he looks at what he considers the great world conspiracies the Jews have foisted upon people to cripple their capacity to realize that they must be in eternal war. Why do people seek peace? Why do people not want war? Because they've been poisoned by certain ideas that Jews have spread. What are these poisonous ideas? They're not only spreading their poisonous blood, but they're spreading these poisonous ideas that basically disarm people, disarm a people to have the will to fight and thus spell their doom. And here's where things get very peculiar. The first great Jewish world conspiracy is Christianity. Now, wrap your mind around that, given how we've been talking about centuries in which Christianity is the religious fomenter of anti-Semitism. Hitler is an anti-Christian anti-Semite. Okay? An anti-Christian anti-Semite. For Hitler, Christianity stands for what? Love thy neighbor like thyself. Turn the other cheek. How do you fight the eternal war for survival and Lebensraum if you're a wimpy Christian who loves your neighbor and turns the other cheek? Christianity is a conspiracy that Jews foisted upon the rest of the world to cripple their capacity to wage the struggle for survival, to gain the survival of the fittest. And if you want to look, what happened to the Roman Empire when it turned Christian? Roman Empire did two things wrong. It mixed its blood with the people it conquered, and it converted to Christianity so a small group of pagan Germans could overrun the whole vast Roman Empire and bring it down. Hardy, pure Germans could basically disrupt and collapse the whole Roman Empire because they had lost the will to fight and defend themselves, because they had been seduced by the first Jewish conspiracy of Christianity. The second great world Jewish conspiracy is liberalism. Equality before the law. All human beings have certain inalienable rights. What nonsense. The whole point of Hitler is that human beings are not equal. And that inequality is the law of nature, and war is the way in which the superior people beat the inferior people. The fit survive and the unfit go down. So for Hitler, the very notion of equality is totally anathema. The preaching of a doctrine of human equality and human rights is exactly what will cripple people's capacities to wage the eternal struggle, just as Christianity in its love thy neighbor did. So the second great iniquitous, poisonous ideology that the Jews have spread to poison the world and disrupt the laws of nature is liberalism. And the French Revolution is its first manifestation. And of course, the Weimar Democratic Constitution, which we'll talk about later, is the high point of importing that liberalism into Germany to keep it from undoing the Versailles Treaty and recovering. The third great Jewish conspiracy is communism, Marxism. Workers of the world unite. You know no country, you know only your class. Class solidarity, not racial solidarity. That too, obviously, is an anathema to Hitler. And that communism is then the third attempt of the Jews to plant poisonous ideas in the world that will destroy people's capacity to wage the eternal struggle for survival, to prove that they are the most fit. So for Hitler now, there's not just a problem of Jews in Germany. Jews are not just another race competing with other races. Jews are the subhuman poison that threatens all races. Because only through struggle does history progress. Only through the struggle for survival will the fittest emerge at the top. And the Jews are trying to undo that struggle for survival. So the fittest will not survive and come to the top. The most unfit will survive, and that the laws of nature will be sabotaged and undone. The path to progress will be, in a sense, subverted. So for Hitler, solving the Jewish question, in a sense, is not only for Germany, but now, in a sense, an obligation to nature itself, to the human condition. And it takes on, then, of course, a whole bigger kind of weight and obsession at that point. So for Hitler, then, both his sense of the geopolitical picture, needing Lebensraum, and the Jewish question have, in a sense, grown in magnitude. The question for Hitler now is, where will Germany get Lebensraum? He's come to the conviction now, we are not going to fight another war just to undo the Versailles Treaty, to get back the snippets of territory that Germany has lost to France and Alsace-Lorraine, to Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein, to the Poles with the Polish corridor. That's nothing. That doesn't solve Germany's problem. That was already apparent when Germany could be starved to death by the British blockade in World War I. Germany needs a much vaster empire. If Germany is going to become a world power that survives, it is, like England, going to have a great overseas empire, or like the United States, find some manifest destiny where it can expand from coast to coast and have the huge empire that it needs. And looking at the map, Hitler's not going to challenge England for overseas empire. He doesn't want to get into that thorny nest again. And that what beckons for Hitler? Germany's manifest destiny, where geography, in a sense, dictates Germany's future lays, must be in the East. It must be expansion to the East, and that Germany's destiny is in a great East empire. Fortunately, he thinks for us, that means territories inhabited by Slavs, which he thinks are inferior to Germans. So in a knockdown, drag-out struggle between the two, Germany will win. But in history's windfall, who has taken over the largest country in the East? The communists. Who are the communists? The Jews. Who cannot preserve a state? Who has proven themselves incapable of establishing and keeping a state? Who is inherently stateless? The Jews. So that for Hitler, the big lucky win of the draw is that Germany is fated to expand to the area where, in fact, you have what appears to be the Russian Colossus, but it's a Colossus with a feet of clay, in which the unfitness of Jews to run a state will be demonstrated when Hitler attacks. So for him, Germany will not challenge Britain overseas. It will seek its destiny, its manifest destiny, if I can ahistorically impose the American term, but it represented, in a sense, the same mindset. Just look at the map and you can see, we were obviously intended to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For Hitler, we're obviously intended to go from Central Europe to the Ural Mountains or beyond. And that is what geopolitics dictates, you might say, for Hitler. How then he puts this all together, and in the end, this then becomes kind of synthesized when he has to take a time out in Landsberg prison to write Mein Kampf, and we'll get to that in a bit, and then writes a second book, which he decided he wouldn't publish in the late 1920s. What this comes together in is a kind of sequence and an understanding in a sense of what must happen and roughly how this will go about. That the first job of any leader of Germany is to throw out the Weimar Republic, this Jewish democracy that will keep Germany weak and is an imposition of victors at Versailles, to create a dictatorship that will make Germany strong internally. Germany must become strong itself, must have a strong dictatorial government. That government must then fight its first war to throw off the protector of the Versailles Treaty, the country that will try to keep Germany artificially down, which is France. But this time, unlike World War I, if he fights France without Italy and England on its side, Germany can free its rear, can dispense with the sheriff of Europe, who is imposing the Versailles Treaty provisions on Germany to keep Germany artificially weak. This will be the big military battle, but it's only a preliminary to the historic battle. The third phase will be Germany's move to the east, where the great destiny lies for him to create Germany as a world power on a great Lebensraum landmass. And that campaign will be a territorial war for Lebensraum, an ideological war to destroy communism, and a race war to destroy the Jews. Where is the greatest concentration of Jews in the world? It is the Pale of settlement in what was Tsarist Russia, Poland and the Baltic states and eastern or western Russia are what he considers the breeding grounds of world Jewry, from which Jews are sent out everywhere to infect other people, while in that place they keep their blood pure and keep producing more Jews to spread and disperse all over the world, so that he will come to grips with, in a sense, the biological center of gravity, the biological nucleus of Jews, and this will be then a race war against Jews, an ideological war against communism, a territorial war for Lebensraum, the package deal. And whether he lives along to do that, someone else after him, he will point the way, he will prepare, and ultimately, of course, he decides it must be accomplished in his own lifetime. But that is the picture Hitler has in his mind by the late 1920s. And it is not, I think, what we would call a blueprint or a grand design, in the sense that it establishes what steps you must take each part of the way. He's going to be very flexible in that. But it does establish his priorities and his framework. Yes, question? You're going to have to talk much louder.
I apologize. How did the Spartacist uprising affect the Nazis at this time?
How did the what?
The Spartacist uprising of the communists?
Oh, that we'll cover a bit later. Please just wait until we get to Barbarossa and the invasion. That will become very central. But you can see the connection. I think you know how that's going to affect them. It's going to be the Jew equals the partisan equals the communist. And basically that's the equation that they have. Communists and partisans and Jews are all one thing, and they all must be destroyed. So to say that's Hitler's kind of worldview. The scary thing is that if you accept the beginning assumptions, if you accept that history is race struggle, and you accept there are such things as biological races, and if you accept the assumption that pure races are strong and mixed races are weak, if you accept those three axioms, there is nothing illogical or irrational about Hitler's conclusions, what he draws out of this. Some people have argued that Hitler is irrational. Hitler's crazy. The problem is Hitler is super rational. The problem is that he thinks this out to its end without any inhibitions or any hesitation. And he himself says, what separates me from other politicians is I follow my logic to its ice-cold conclusion. He says, I will not shy away from the implications of my ideology. Other politicians compromise. Other politicians shirk and shrink back from the implications. Hitler says, no, I don't. I will follow this to the end. I will remain totally bound by the logic of my ideology. In a sense, what ideology means is the logic of an idea. And Hitler is going to be super ideological. And there's nothing irrational in the way in which he operates once you grant his premises. Now, I think his premises are crazy. I think they're crazy. I think they're horrible. But nonetheless, once he has those, how he operates is in fact going to be frighteningly logical and without compromise that so many of his politicians are going to follow. Now, if one question, in a sense, is what does Hitler believe? A second question is why does he believe these things? And in the particularly in the 1970s, there was a period in which people tried. Historians are basically scavengers of disciplines. We will take economics and sociology and political science and all sorts of anthropology, sociology, and we use them for our purposes. And there was a group of people in the 70s that said, well, you need to use psychology too. People that call themselves the psychohistorians. And that we should bring the insights of psychiatry to history to understand the people that we're looking at. And so there was a brief flurry of people that wanted to psychoanalyze Hitler and try to understand not just what he believed, but what would impel him to believe that way. And it became a kind of cottage industry for a while. There were problems with it. And one of the problems, of course, is that basically they were mostly all working on a basis of Freudian psychology. They did not yet ask, was there a chemical imbalance in Hitler's brain or some of the kind of things we deal with now. It was a very dated psychology to understanding that people had problems because in their first 4 years of life they didn't relate to their parents properly and they got mixed up in their sex. And so that sexual problems and parental problems in the first 4 years were kind of what Freudians concentrated on. And of course, the problem here is that for historians, that's exactly the area in which we had almost no evidence about Hitler whatsoever. So these people were trying to write history without evidence. They were trying to theorize and to talk about what might be, but the fragmentary evidence was so slender that it ultimately led to a process of kind of circular reasoning. And what they would do would be look at Hitler and see, in a sense, him compared to some psychological syndrome or some psychological problem that they encountered elsewhere. And then, on the basis of what they learned about the problem elsewhere, then look at that with the lens through which they would look at this fragmentary evidence and decide this fragmentary evidence or these rumors must be true, and then on the basis they were true, ratify the hypothesis they put up in the first place. So the hypothesis becomes the means by which you prove the evidence, becomes the means by which you prove the hypothesis. A classic circular reasoning, but this is what they had to work with. But let me just give you a couple examples. You can see kind of the problems here. There was a study of what became known as sort of the anti-Semitic typology. People who in the American army had shown themselves to be quite anti-Semitic, and they were looked at for what characteristics they had. And then could those be applied to Hitler? And another kind of model they had, one of the few things we actually had evidence for was the Russian autopsy of the charred body of Hitler's corpse was reported by the Russians to be a case of Hitler having either a missing or undescended testicle, that he had what we call monarchism. And this then led people to say, well, he could have had a minor physical abnormality syndrome. What do people with minor physical abnormalities, how does this disturb or upset their personality development? And so they would look at Hitler and they would find many things in his character seem to fit into people who had one of those two, either a anti-Semitic typology or a minor physical abnormality syndrome. And so they would say, well, all those people seem to be narcissistic. They have a compensatory self-aggrandizement, a megalomania, that they orient to the strong and reject the weak. They have a bully syndrome, that they have a aggressive paranoia, that they have revenge fantasies, and they have a defense mechanism of projection. They project upon others their own problems. And then they would say, we see this in Hitler, we see this in those other peoples, and therefore Hitler's problem must be similar to theirs. And in the case of the anti-Semitic typology, one psychologist hypothesized, this basically is a way for people who have a great sense of guilt, a great sense of self-loathing for something in themselves, that they need to project upon others. And that his hypothesis was that Hitler had a very gross sexual deviancy. We have no evidence for that, but that's what he hypothesized. And the other, as we've said, was that Hitler was overcompensating for his physical abnormality. They wedded these to a Freudian interpretation. Hitler's father was much older than his mother. His mother was the third wife. That his father was distant and overbearing. His mother, who smothered him with affection, and that he had this Oedipal complex. He loved his mother, hated his father, and couldn't get his own male orientation straight, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can read all this fascinating stuff to read. It just doesn't happen to be terribly convincing. But all of that, in the end, hasn't led, I think, us to think that it helps. When you clear all the decks and you're done with it, I think what we do conclude is that Hitler was a borderline personality. He certainly was not insane. He was very functional. But he has a borderline personality and an obsessive personality. He's clearly obsessed with Jews, and that he does have some of the characteristics these people have seen of narcissism, megalomania, revenge fantasy, and a projection. We can find that in Hitler in all sorts of ways. But it doesn't help us to understand why the Holocaust happened. That we've got lots of people have that, but they don't turn into Hitler. You've got a world filled with people of these kinds of problems, but fortunately they don't all become Hitlers, so we're back to square one, I think. And that is back to the political story of how did a man like Hitler, with his beliefs, become Chancellor of Germany and harness an entire nation to commit genocide. It still ultimately, for the historian, becomes more of a political problem to explain, not a psychological problem. And so I will just want you to be aware of the psychological dimension, who the psychohistorians are, and why I think that turned out to be a kind of dead end that, as I said, was a cottage industry that kind of petered out. Okay, I think we better get going again. One term I didn't explain fully, I guess in the first half, was Judeo-Bolshevism. And this is a term that comes up after the stab in the back legend, in which both socialists or Marxists in Germany are viewed as the anti-war party, and the Jews as the alien in Germany, had stabbed Germany's war effort in the back, brought about its defeat. The two are combined. And as we've seen for Hitler, the third great world Jewish conspiracy is Marxism or communism. Communism, Bolshevism was the term more commonly used in the 1920s. And so often, and particularly in the right, the phrase Judeo-Bolshevism, that these two are the same, became increasingly prevalent. So Bolshevism and the Jews are a package deal. You explain Bolshevism because this is what Jews do. This is the current form of the Jewish assault on Germany and civilization. And so Judeo-Bolshevism is the great threat that Europe is facing in the 1920s in this mindset. And as I said, the term is simply contracted into one. It's important, I think, when looking overall, to understand that for Germans, between 1914 and 1933, they are going to experience, 5 crises of extraordinary magnitude that most generations don't experience even one of them, much less 5 of them together. From 1914 to 18, they're going to fight Europe's first industrial total war, which had a staggering cost that no one had anticipated beforehand. Secondly, they're going to experience that in defeat. They're going to go down without the compensation of victory for all of what they had sacrificed. Thirdly, they're going to have revolution. The Kaiser is going to be thrown out. A new form of government is going to be imposed. Fourth, they're going to have in the early 20s not just inflation, but a hyperinflation in which money is printed so fast it simply can't keep the zeros up. Money loses its meaning. And then in 1929, the Great Depression, in which unemployment in Germany is going to go beyond even that in the United States. The United States has reached about 25%. In Germany, it will be 1 in 3, over 30% in its peaks. So Germans are living through a series of body blows, a series of crises that most people don't have to experience. Most political systems do not have to survive. So that in the background, I think, is important to keep there, just how traumatic life is in Germany in this compressed period of 1914 to 1933. But that is a crucial background for the things that are going to happen, and that will be part of the historical situation that enables someone like Hitler to come to power. Having said that, nonetheless, this was not inevitable. History is contingent. Things don't happen until they happen, and they didn't have to happen the way they did. So we don't want to lose sight either of the catastrophic framing of this period or the contingency of it if we want to try to follow, in a sense, what takes place. We did talk about the defeat, and ended in a revolution in which the Kaiser flees into exile. And Germany has to create a new government. In the wake of defeat, the old order and the conservative side of the political spectrum, which was so responsible for launching the war and proclaiming throughout that Germany was on the brink of victory, is sufficiently discredited that Germany in early 1919 adopts a ultra-democratic constitution and form of government. The framers meet in the town of Weimar, like the Philadelphia Convention of the 13 colonies, and hence this is referred to as the Weimar Republic. Republic because Germany is no longer a monarchy. The Kaiser has fled, and no one is allowed to succeed him. And the new government will be a parliamentary democracy. And indeed, it is intended by experts that they consult to be the most modern, most democratic, most up-to-date constitution that experts can devise. Very quickly, however, this democracy is going to be faced with a number of problems. One of the problems that it continually has to face is what I would call the incomplete revolution. From the moment the German Revolution begins, how to get rid of the Kaiser, how to make peace, how to draw up a democratic constitution, the specter that hovers over Germany is the fact that in the Soviet Union, they began with a revolution that threw out the Tsar, and they created a provisional government that would try to create a parliamentary regime in Russia. and it then quickly slid into a Bolshevik coup, a civil war, and a communist dictatorship. So for many in Germany, the great threat is not how to make sure the German Revolution goes far enough to anchor the new democracy safely, but how to ensure the revolution doesn't go too far too fast to spin out of control and fall into the hands of the communists. That it isn't a transitory government like the provisional government in Russia that simply opens the door to a communist revolution from the left and what Germans, many considered the horrors of Bolshevism. And given what happened in the Soviet Union with Stalin, this was not an unrealistic fear. I mean, this was not, paranoia out of the blue. And so how to find that balance, how to have enough of a revolution, but not too much of a revolution, was what Germans wrestled with. And in hindsight, we see they basically had too little of a revolution, an incomplete revolution, not going far enough, that allowed the Weimar Republic then to be utterly vulnerable to counter-revolution, to a resurgence from the right. So when you had this new constitution adopted, it did not drastically reform the German army and the general staff, so German militarism remains entrenched. It did not reform the educational system. Most German schools in the 20s continued to teach history as the stab in the back. Imagine all of the public schools basically teaching a theory that delegitimizes the very government of the country that is financing the public education. They do not reform the judicial system so that you have a right-wing judiciary appointed by the Kaiser trying to impose law and order, but with an utterly double standard of justice. There were something, I think the figures are, there were something like 470 or 480 political assassinations in the first 3 or 4 years of the Weimar Republic. That a tiny fraction of those, 20 or 30 of them, are carried out by the left. 435 of them are carried out by right-wing assassins. The total number of prison years that right-wing assassins served was something like 90 years if you add up all their terms. And the total number of years that the left wing was into the hundreds. As they basically put away left-wing assassins for life terms, and right-wing assassins were given a tap on the wrist. You're well-meaning, you went a little bit too far, don't do that again, and you're free to go. So that the political violence of Germany will be fostered by the fact that there is almost no consequences, no punishment for right-wing terror. And that is a result of the double standard of justice. And we'll see when Hitler commits treason and tries to overthrow the government, he sits in prison for 9 months, entertaining his friends and writing Mein Kampf, and eating well enough that he gains weight. This is a major part of the incomplete revolution. There is at least some reform in the sense of labor unions gaining power for collective bargaining, and so forth. But many aspects of the old regime, of the infrastructure of the old regime, are left completely intact, and the Weimar Republic will be a veneer painted over a very conservative infrastructure in which the government is at war with its own run infrastructure, in which the infrastructure opposes and does not support the government itself. And so that is a very precarious factor for the regime to live through. The second is that in polarized Germany, very quickly, the discrediting of the right and the brief window of opportunity the Democrats had to put in the Weimar Constitution disappears. The right wing resurges, and that you have a country in which you have one expression of it was the candle burning at both ends. On the one end, you have a communist party trying to overthrow the government. You have a coalition of 3 key parties, which are a liberal democratic party, and if we look up on the map here, or no, we don't have that yet, a Catholic party and the Social Democrats, which are the so-called Weimar Coalition. And then you have a collection of right-wing parties which are opposed to democracy itself. And that after 1920, after the first year in which the Weimar Republic exists, the Weimar Coalition, the three parties that provided the majority, that provided the democratic constitution, never have a majority in a German election again. You are trying to run a democracy in which you have no democratic majority to preserve that democracy. And a democracy without a majority that favors democracy is a real problem. You simply don't have the consensus on the norms. You don't have the consensus on the guardrails that will keep people agreeing what the rules of the game are, but fighting, playing playing the same sport by the same rules on the same field, agreeing with the ground rules are. And so this is a recipe for political instability. That a major dilemma of the Weimar Republic is, how do you preserve a democracy with too few Democrats? And Germany never solves that problem either. So these are endemic problems that are there at the beginning. We'll see in the Constitution itself, despite the best intentions of the designers, certain provisions are put into it that we see in hindsight are going to backfire and make it more difficult for the democratic Constitution to function as well. But as I say, that is not as major, I think, as a infrastructure that does not support the government and a lack of broad consensus behind a democratic government. So this is in a sense, the political system with which Hitler is going to fish in troubled waters. And it is going to be ideal for those who want to destabilize, very difficult for those who want to stabilize the situation, to allow a democratic culture to gradually sink roots and gain legitimacy. Munich in particular is a hotbed of instability. In Munich, the politics are of violence in the streets, street fighting. The typical thing is for various little splinter parties to have rallies at their particular beer garden. You have your turf in the city, and the challenge is for other parties to come and break it up, and then you have a good fight. And at each of the rallies, the speaker gives inciting speeches, which the other side tries to interrupt and to break up. So parties also usually had a paramilitary wing that was to defend the party group. In the National Socialist Party, it's the SA. This was called the Stormtroopers, the Sturmabteilungen, or the brown shirts, because the way in which you distinguished yourself, you knew whose side you were on, is you were color-coded in terms of a uniform. So the Nazis dressed in their brown shirts. They had their party guard, in a sense, that would defend their beer hall and defend Hitler when he spoke, and would go off and try to disrupt somebody else's rallies and speeches as well. Violence in the streets, a politics of incitement and rallies and so forth is the common thing of the day. It's also a period in which political assassination was ripe. There are hundreds of people who are shot, killed because of their politics by people who view themselves as political avengers. The vast majority carried out by right-wing gunmen, though the vast majority of the punishment was on the much numerically smaller left-wing communist violence rather than on the right-wing terror. It was in this circumstances that things became more and more unstable within the Republic. And in 1923, it appeared that it was going to fall apart completely. In 1923, the government is supposed to be paying to the victors reparations. Basically, the Versailles Treaty had three key provisions. One was a German loss of territory. The second was German disarmament. And the third was German reparations. That Germany was supposed to pay to France and England, not for the cost of the war, but for the civilian damages that had been inflicted by German occupation in northern France and in Belgium. And it was a hefty bill, but it was supposed to be stretched out over many decades. Germany certainly had imposed a huge reparations bill on France in 1870 at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, and now was utterly indignant that when they lost the war, somebody else imposed reparations on themselves. As I said, they thought wars were heads we win, tails we draw, and Germany is ever to pay the consequences for defeat. and you had political parties all agreeing the Versailles Treaty was illegitimate, draconic, unfair, that Germany is being victimized, and reparations are a key aspect of that universally felt sense of victimization. Germany fails to make certain reparations payments in early 1923, claiming they can't make them. And the French decide if Germany gets away with claiming incapacity to pay, they'll never start paying again. And the way to force them to pay is to occupy the German industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, where the German coal and steel industry is centered, and simply control German industry and take what they want as reparations until the Germans buckle. The Germans' response was to say passive resistance. All the workers in the Ruhr are to not go to work, so the French can't get any steel and can't get any coal. To do that, the government has to promise to pay the workers. To pay the workers, they have no money. They start turning the printing presses. And so you get a continual printing of new money simply to pay the bills, and the result is a runaway inflation. Now, we talk about many countries today, inflation is running at 1 or 2 or 3%. If it gets up to 8%, you really worry. If it gets up to double figures, in the teens, it's really frightening. We're talking about inflation that was running in the hundreds and thousands of percent. Some of you may have seen photos from the Weimar period of 1923 of workers coming home from the factories with wheelbarrows filled with money with nothing but zeros on them at midday at the lunch break, so the housewife can go and spend it before it loses 2/3 of its value before he'd come home in the evening. And in the stores, chalkboards, because you can't print any prices. You have to be erasing and changing the prices every half hour. Till the point that the money simply lost its value. Weimar currency collapsed. And for a society that had been built on a modern economy, when money isn't work anymore, you're in real problems. This is an economic crisis. Secondly, for the communists, this was seen as a chance to carry out their own designs. In a couple of the German states, there were attempted communist uprisings. They too were trying to overthrow the Weimar Republic. And for Hitler in Bavaria, in Munich, this is the point at which he decides, okay, now is the time to strike. The model he had was the year before, Mussolini carried out his so-called March on Rome. When the Italian government became paralyzed, he basically mobilized his own fascist party, which had its own black shirts, not brown shirts, and they all marched on Rome, in effect saying to the government, either you have to shoot us down or you have to put us in power. You have to call our bluff or you have to give in. And the government gave in and made Mussolini prime minister, and over a period of time, of course, he built up his dictatorship. For Hitler, the notion was if he could seize power in Munich, you could have a march on Berlin, and the dominoes would fall, and the Weimar Republic would collapse. So he's going to try to emulate Mussolini and start with a march to seize City Hall in Munich, and this is called the Beer Hall Putsch. At the Nazis' major beer hall, the Bürgerbräu, he gets up and gives his talk. They all are mobilize the next morning and march down the main street of Munich to City Hall and seize power. He thinks he has the police and the local military commander acquiescing to this. When he comes the next morning, it turns out that they have not acquiesced, and the police and the military shoot on the Nazis, unlike what the Italian government did vis-a-vis Mussolini. They call his bluff, and they treat this as a treasonous uprising, and they shoot 10 Nazis down in the streets, and Hitler is arrested and tried for treason, which this was. So the Beer Hall Putsch is a fiasco, a collapse. It does not pull off the domino collapse of Munich to Berlin that Hitler had hoped. And Hitler has to take a timeout from politics. He is tried. There is a trial, and a trial which he exploits very well. One, it has very sympathetic right-wing judges who are letting him do what he wants. When he takes the stand, he uses this as a tribune to gain huge name recognition in Germany, makes himself the accuser. The Weimar Republic really is the defendant. The Weimar criminals are the ones who really should be in the dock, and tries to invert this into He's the persecuted hero. The real bad guys are the ones trying to put him in jail. And that, of course, is music to the ears of much of the German right. And Hitler gets in defeat, in a sense, a notoriety, a recognition that he didn't have as a street fighter and rally instigator in Munich up until that point. He is sentenced, I think, actually to 5 years. In the end, he's released very early. He serves about 9 months in Landsberg prison. We have photos of him holding salon, in a sense, in his the common room of the prison, the tables heaped with food and visitors all around. So it's not a terribly onerous imprisonment. And he has his own secretary there, Rudolf Hess, to take his dictation as he writes Mein Kampf. So this is not a strenuous timeout from politics, and one that he uses very well. When he comes back into politics, he does understand that he's going to have to operate in a different way. That he understands that in a modern government, in a modern world, given the firepower that a modern police and a modern military have, you do not carry out revolution in a violent manner. Back in the 18th century, when you had single-shot, muzzle-loading muskets and whatever, you could storm the Bastille. You could mobilize a mob and you could storm the Bastille in the French Revolution. In a modern day, when you have machine guns and whatever else, you're not going to storm town hall if the military and the police are armed and ready to fight you off. And that therefore, the notion of coming to power through a coup, coming to power through a military seizure of power or a paramilitary seizure of power is not going to work. And therefore, Hitler hereafter argues for what he calls the tactics of legality. In the Weimar Republic, we're going to have to come to power legally through the mechanisms of German democracy in order to destroy German democracy. We will have to play by their rules till we get to power. In power, we will revamp this whole system entirely and undo Weimar democracy. But until that point, we're going to have to win playing in their ballpark, playing by their rules. So the tactics of legality is going to be key. And Hitler now is going to reorganize the Nazi Party. And it's going to cease to be a kind of street-fighting bunch of thugs who are out there to protect their beer hall and disrupt other people's rallies into an electoral vehicle. How do you recruit members? How do you get them to vote? How do you run candidates for office? So the Nazi Party is going to become an electoral party instead of a street-fighting party. The SA will still be there, but the SA is to be an adjunct to the electoral campaign, not the core of the party to seize power. The party is then going to shift in other ways. Up until now, Hitler in Munich, competing for working class vote, many of his speeches have a fair socialist flavor. Like early Sturcker, we talked about earlier, trying to win the working class away from Marxism with Christianity, Hitler was trying to win them away with nationalism. After the beer hall putsch, when he's going now towards the electoral, socialism gets played way down, nationalism gets played way up. And this becomes a ultra-nationalist, hyper-nationalist party, and it will be beating the nationalist drum that becomes at the core of what Hitler is doing. And again, as I say, now becoming a cross-class party. Not fighting for urban votes in Munich, but fighting for everybody in Germany, become a national party. And much of the electoral campaign now will shift from Munich, Bavaria, to northern Germany, from the areas of a Catholic majority to areas of a Protestant majority, from urban Munich to the rural and small towns. And the Nazis are going to have their greatest electoral success in the rural and small town areas, in the Protestant areas, and in northern Germany over southern Germany, among a younger vote as opposed to an older vote, more men than women, though in fact they're going to have a very strong women's vote too. But it basically is going to focus on and expand to become a national party competing on nationalism with a cross-party appeal, but having its greatest success in the rural and small towns of Protestant northern Germany. and among youth as opposed to people older who already have preformed political loyalties and habits. So the tactics of legalities that turned Hitler's party between 24 and 29 into an electoral party, not into a party for an armed coup d'etat. Now, in the period of 1924 to 29, in fact, is a brief period of relative prosperity and stability. After the crisis of 1923, Germany creates a new currency. Germany creates a broader coalition in which some of the parties that had opposed Weimar democracy agreed to take part in the cabinet and to help it function, realizing how dangerously close they came to catastrophe. So that from 24 to 29, you have a German democracy, but it's one in which the cabinets, to have simply a majority cabinet, you basically have to have a coalition that stretches from German big landowner agrarians and factory owners on the right through to the Social Democrats on the left. And then the communists are on one end and the ultra-fascists and anti-democrats on the other. That's what's necessary in a sense to keep Germany going. That functions until the great stock market crash in the United States and the onset of the World Depression. One of the things that kept Germany going in 1924 to 1929, after it creates a new currency and after it sort of restarts its economy, was American investments and loans. What the Americans sort of do is to make the whole reparations system work. Germany has to resume payments of reparations to France, Belgium, and England. France, Belgium, and England have to repay their war debts to the United States. The United States had lent them a lot of money in the war. And in turn, the United States will invest and make loans to Germany. So somebody's sitting there, changing columns, and the money is just going in a big circle to keep all of this artificially afloat. And it keeps things afloat as long as that circle isn't interrupted. Well, come November 1929, stock market crash, what do American investors have to do? They have to call in all their loans because they've been caught short on stock that has lost its value. They certainly aren't going to be investing new when the economy is going way down. And the withdrawal of American capital from Germany is like pulling the rug from outside under the German economy. And of all the countries in the world alongside the United States, the one that collapses into depression the most intensively and the quickest is the utterly fragile, precarious German economy. So it will have unemployment rates, as I say, in 1930 to 32, even exceeding what happened in Herbert Hoover's United States. And so the Great Depression hits everybody, but the countries hit the worst in the sense of the United States and Germany. This, for Hitler, is good news. This opens the door, new instability, and will allow him to begin to experience considerable and rapid gain. We do know from tracing local elections that even before the stock market crash, even before the collapse of the economy in 1929, the Nazis were experiencing some significant upticks in local elections. With the Depression, now this trickle of uptick is going to turn into, as we'll see, a torrent. In any case, what's key in this are several things. One, in 1929, the Allies offer to Germany a new reparations deal. Let's reconfigure the payments, stretch them out over a longer period of time, and make the payments smaller. And if Germany had continued to pay reparations by the plan of the Young Plan, as it was called, they would have been finished in 1988. But they never were going to pay those, of course. But in any case, the Young Plan was one that the beleaguered Weimar government agreed to because it lowered immediate payments, kicked the can down the road, and which the alt-right, the anti-democrats in Germany immediately jumped on is as treasonous, weak, not defending Germany. We shouldn't be paying reparations at all. And one of the provisions of the very democratic Weimar Constitution was that issues for which you could get sufficient number of signatures, you could put as a referendum before the people. What could be more democratic than letting the people decide instead of the German Reichstag? And so in 1929, there was a Young Plan referendum campaign. in which the right wing in Germany campaigns against the plan, trying to get enough votes to have it rescinded. They are looking for a rabble-rousing speaker. Who do they choose? Who is hired by the old right in Germany to be their spokesman for the referendum campaign? Adolf Hitler. And this then, again, after the trial in 23, this is his second great exposure nationwide in Germany. They are now footing the bill to send him all over Germany, getting great coverage in the press because one of the most important leaders on the right in Germany at that time was the equivalent of Murdoch and Fox News, the one who controlled much of the media, and is throwing all of his weight behind this and now giving all of this intense coverage to Hitler. So Hitler is getting prominence even before the collapse of the stock market and the Depression, which will put him exactly in the opportune position. The Great Depression does something else, and that is it really destroys the capacity of Germany to govern itself according to the Weimar Constitution. The Weimar Constitution, we have to go through a whole series of provisions of it as we go through this. One provision was that Germany would have voting by what was known as PR, proportional representation. So that Germany, instead of having small congressional districts, like in the United States, and one representative from each district, and whoever got the plurality won the district. In Germany, you have big districts, and you have a number of delegates from each district, and they are distributed according to the percentage of vote that your party gets. So if, in fact, say in Westphalia, the Catholics get 10%, they get one of 10 delegates. And if the Social Democrats get 30%, they get 3 delegates. And if the Liberals get 10%, they get 1 delegate, and so on and so forth. What this meant was that it fostered a multi-party system. Every cause thought if they ran a candidate, they stood a chance of getting at least 1 delegate. And then in whatever negotiations that took place when all of these people met at the Reichstag, you might have the balance of power that required them to pay you off to bring you into the coalition. So rather than in a English-American system, the pressure is towards consolidation and big parties that build coalitions within the party to vote for one candidate who will be the one that gets the plurality, because that's the only one that gets a representative. In proportional representation, the reward goes to all the fringe parties that will hold the balance because no one will ever have a majority, and you hope you get that crucial amount that allows you the leverage to extort all the others to give you inordinate power for your very small delegation. So the result was all the Weimar governments are coalitions. They're always precarious because if anybody walks out, they could fall. And putting a new one together is always a difficult problem. As I said, the model we have today is the Israeli government, and if you look at how they put together coalitions, and they're running their 3rd parliamentary election in 1 year because no one in the last year has been able to get a parliamentary majority in Israel, you can see how this is a prescription for instability and in a highly fragmented or divided society to put together a necessary majority. What happens in 1929, 1930 is the capacity to put together a majority evaporates. It evaporates because there is a fundamental division among the parties that are willing to at least support parliamentary government. There is nonetheless an irreconcilable difference over what economic policy to adopt now that the Great Depression has set in. On the conservative end of the political spectrum, the conventional wisdom is that you meet economic crisis with austerity. That if, in fact, the economy is going down, the only way to get it to go up again is to restore confidence. And above all, in Germany, after the hyperinflation, that meant confidence in the currency and in currency stability. And to do that, it meant you had to balance the budget. Now, in a depression, as people are going out of business, as people are being laid off and workers lose their jobs, tax receipts go way down. As economy slows and economy drops, the GDP drops, the tax receipts of the government go down too. If your answer to that is austerity, and a balanced budget, what the government then does is cut all sorts of its own expenditures. You don't build the next highway. You don't build the next bridge. You don't build the next post office. You don't build the next battleship. You don't expand the number of civil servants you're hiring. You fire teachers and have bigger classroom sizes and whatever and whatever. You do all sorts of things to cut government expenditures. What happens to all those people who are not hired to build the next school or the next highway or are fired from their job? They have no income. They pay no taxes. What happens to government revenues? It goes down again. What is the government response if austerity is the policy? To cut more government expenditures. Now, this is Herbert Hoover economics. This is what happened in the United States. This is conventional wisdom. That you chased your tail in a downward spiral that drove an economic recession into a horrific depression. That you simply crashed. The idea was you would hit bottom and then the economy would recover. Well, they hit bottom and smashed the whole thing and it didn't recover. And Germany does this and the United States did this. At least in Germany, that's what the conservative side of the cabinet was demanding. The Social Democrats say, no, we don't have austerity. In times of economic downturn, you need to prime the pump. You need to intentionally run deficits in order to make up for the lost purchasing power of people who are out of jobs, in order to create new work. The government has to step in and create demand, create jobs to get the economy going again. And so you have to run an intentional deficit. You have to prime the pump. That's what the Social Democrats wanted to do. And the big industrialists and the Social Democrats could not sit in the same cabinet because they could not agree on a common budget. The government collapsed. And then the question is, what happens when you can't put together a majority government? What the Weimar Constitution stipulated was that in a crisis in which no one can put together a majority government, the president of the country, this is a supposedly apolitical position elected to a 7-year term that is not part of the regular election cycle, will appoint a chancellor. That chancellor will have the power to issue a budget and to issue laws by emergency presidential decree that will be valid unless there is a negative majority in the Reichstag that vetoes them. So that as long as you have enough people who don't vote down the emergency laws and don't vote down the budget that the chancellor puts forward, a presidentially appointed chancellor can govern Germany by emergency decree without a parliamentary majority. He doesn't need a parliamentary majority for him. He just cannot have a parliamentary majority against him. So as long as people abstain and throw up their hands and say, let somebody else solve the problem, you can go through this narrow window of running Germany by a presidentially appointed chancellor with powers of emergency decree with no majority. And that's what the president decides to do in 1930. Now, the president of the Republic is Paul von Hindenburg. And it's important to understand, the first president elected by the Weimar Republic, a man named Ebert, you don't have to have that, was a very pro-democrat, a social democrat who was very much in favor of the Weimar Republic. In 1925, the Germans elect a president who is the war hero field marshal of World War I that was very much on the right and has little sympathy for nor understanding of how democracies function, and in fact would look forward to a more authoritarian revision of government if he had the chance. So the Weimar Republic, designed by its supporters to create a safety net in the form of a president with presidential powers to save the Republic in crisis, ends up with a president who isn't pro-democratic, who now has the powers to use, not to save the Republic, but to bury the Republic. And this, of course, was unintended. It was not foreseen. It should have been foreseen, but it certainly was not the intended result of those emergency powers. Those emergency powers of the president are called Article 48, and we'll run some more of them. This is the first of those, that he can appoint a presidential chancellor to rule through decree as long as that is not vetoed by a negative majority in the Reichstag. Hindenburg appoints a man named Heinrich Brüning to be his new chancellor. Heinrich Brüning is going to advocate an austerity program, which, as I say, is going to be a chase the tail in a downward spiral in which they continually try to cut the budget in order to restore confidence. And what it's going to do is create an ever retreating government budget that never can be made small enough to catch up with declining tax receipts. But it will nosedive the economy into a horrendous depression. But Brüning can get away with it for one reason, and that is the Social Democrats are caught in a big quandary. And that quandary becomes really apparent in 1930, in the 1930 elections, which we now have to turn to make sense of what happens over the next several years. When Brüning first tries to put through his budget, his austerity budget, the socialists vote against it, along with the communists and anybody else that wants the government to fail, and the budget is vetoed. Brüning's response is to call early elections. Germany had elections in 1928. They didn't have to have Reichstag elections until 1932. But Brüning dissolves parliament because there is no majority and his budget has been vetoed, and says, let's take the issue to the country. Let's have a vote and we'll see who can put together a new majority. Then what we get is the first of several key elections here. This September 1930 election is going to be the great breakthrough for the Nazis that is going to transform German politics. If you look at, can we go down to the scale here? Yeah. If you look across that, you will see in 1928, I have only 4 of the parties up there, but you have the NSDAP, National Socialist Party, and then you have the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the Center Party, the Catholic Party of Germany. There were a whole bunch of other ones, but these are the key players. In 1928, the Nazis had 800,000 votes in Germany, 2.6% of the vote. They have 12 delegates in the Reichstag, compared to the communists, who have over 10% of the vote and 54 delegates, compared to the socialists, who have 150 delegates. Social Democrats are the largest party in Germany, and the Catholic Party that has 62 delegates. So the Nazis are a minor fringe party way at the bottom. Look what happens in 1930. They go from 800,000 to 6.4 million Germans. They go from 2.6% of the vote to 18.3% of the vote, from 12 delegates to 107 delegates. The only party bigger than them will be the SPD with 143. They pass by the communists, they pass by the Center Party. They have zoomed out of nowhere into second place in Germany. They are now a major player. That what we talked about in 39 or 29, Hitler getting the publicity of championing the referendum, the effects of the stock market collapse, have now simply opened up German politics. And so the question is, where did all these votes come from? How does a political party on the fringe, when we know that political voting is habit forming, people who start voting for a party, it's very hard to break your allegiance and go and vote elsewhere. The number of swing voters out there is not very great. People talk about in American politics, Trump has a base of 43%, the Democrats maybe a little more, and then there is a swing vote of about 10 to 15% that everybody is fighting over and deciding, who's going to win the next election. How does any party, suddenly come out of nowhere to become the second largest party in the country? What we find is that in Germany at this point, there were 2 phenomena that are crucial. There have been a whole slew of splinter parties where people, in a sense, were parking their vote on some non-consequential splinter party that had no, weight. They couldn't elect anybody, but you voted for them out of some kind of sympathy. Didn't have delegates that weren't important, but nonetheless, that's where you parked your vote until you found a party you were looking for. And there were large numbers of people that weren't voting at all. Apathy, that simply because the system wasn't stirring their enthusiasm. that going to the polls was not important. For Germany in this vote, there are 4.2 million new voters, people who had never voted before. And of those 4.2 million new voters, 3 million of them are going to vote Nazi. That they scoop up virtually, almost three-quarters of the new vote. Many of those are going to be young voters, that the Nazis get the youth vote in overwhelming percentages. And many of them are people who simply hadn't felt any party that attracted them yet, that now the Nazis have a resonance with them that no other political party until that point did. So one half this vote basically is really going to come from new voters. They are also going to savage the middle class party vote. The party of the German professionals, the party of German business, these parties are almost going to disappear from the map as the Nazis vacuum them up. And all these splinter parties, people who had wasted their vote on some symbolic non-entity party, are going to basically get vacuumed up by the Nazis. So it's not that they win socialists or communists or Catholics, but they win most of the other people who are out there and able to be captured. So Hitler zooms into, as I say, second place. And now Brüning is in even a greater quandary. Nonetheless, what he does is he offers the austerity budget a second time. And this time, the socialists are decide to abstain. And so the austerity budget goes through. For the socialists, this is the dilemma. They are basically in a lose-lose position. If they defend the interests of the working class and oppose the austerity budget, all they will do is get yet another election, and the chances for the Nazis to get much greater. If they abstain and allow the austerity vote to go through and do not defend working class interests, they open the door to the communists who say the socialists aren't defending the workers, come over to the communists, we will. So whatever the socialists do, they're going to lose. And lose they will. But they decide that the greater evil are the Nazis. The greater evil is allowing another election. And so they adopt a position what's called passive tolerance. They will tolerate Brüning in power. They won't vote against him. So he can, in fact, govern Germany with a minority government, decreeing austerity budgets by virtue of the emergency powers of the Constitution. And that will last for 2 years. For 2 years, Germany will be in a kind of constitutional limbo. Technically, the Constitution is still in effect. But in reality, Germany is not being run by a parliamentary majority. Weimar democracy, in a sense, has ceased to function, even if the Weimar Constitution is still technically intact. On the local level, the Nazis are running for every election in every town, in every county, and gearing up their electoral machine to keep their momentum going. Following the tactics of legality, Hitler is committed to coming to power through elections, and these 2 years won't show on the national level. There's no national election which we can trace how fast they're growing. But on the local level, they're taking over one town after another, one county after another, and continuing to grow. We will pick up things in 1932 next week.